The lights burned hot under the studio stage, casting a sharp glow over Karoline Leavitt as she sat, composed, across from the man who had made a career out of tearing down faith. The audience hushed, sensing something electric in the air. "Miss Leavitt, let's be honest," Jeremy Kane sneered, adjusting his designer glasses. "Faith is just an emotional crutch for those afraid to face reality. Science disproves God at every turn, yet people like you cling to fairy tales." Karoline's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with a confidence that made even the most hardened skeptics shift in their seats. "That's an interesting claim, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice measured but charged. "And yet, here you are, dedicating your career to fighting something you insist doesn't exist. Why are you so afraid of a God you claim isn't real?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kane blinked, caught off guard. For the first time in his career, he didn't have a comeback ready, and America was about to find out why. The invitation had been public, bold, direct, and impossible for Jeremy Kane to ignore. Karoline Leavitt had seen the clip circulating online, where Kane, the infamous late-night talk show host and self-proclaimed atheist avenger, sneered at the idea of faith. He had ridiculed believers as intellectually bankrupt, mocked religious leaders as peddlers of delusion, and, most personally, dismissed Karoline herself as yet another right-wing puppet clinging to myths. It wasn't the first time Kane had made a spectacle of tearing down faith, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. His audience, millions strong, thrived on his sharp wit and brutal takedowns. He prided himself on reducing even the most seasoned theologians to stuttering defenses, his rapid-fire logic leaving no room for emotional rebuttals. But Karoline wasn't afraid of him. She had grown up in a world where faith wasn't a crutch, it was a foundation. Sunday mornings spent in wooden pews, listening to sermons that weren't just words but calls to action. A childhood spent watching her parents live their beliefs, helping the less fortunate, standing firm when their values were tested. So when Kane's words hit the internet, Karoline didn't stay silent. She issued a challenge. "Let's settle this, face to face, live." The network executives seized on the opportunity immediately. A debate between Karoline Leavitt, the sharp-witted rising conservative star, and Jeremy Kane, the king of atheist rhetoric. It was television gold. The buzz exploded across social media, drawing battle lines before the first words were even spoken. Kane, never one to back down from a fight, especially not one broadcast to millions, accepted. Now, under the bright lights of a national broadcast studio, the stage was set. Karoline sat, poised, waiting for the cameras to roll. Across from her, Kane smirked, his usual confidence radiating through the screen. He was ready to humiliate her, to dismantle her faith, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but doubt. What he didn't know was that Karoline had come prepared, not just with facts, but with something far more powerful, truth. And before the night was over, America would witness a battle that neither of them would ever forget. Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to confrontation. She had spent years honing her ability to stand firm in the face of hostility, first as a young conservative in a liberal college classroom, then as a rising voice in media and politics. But faith wasn't just something she debated. It was the core of who she was. She had grown up in the small town of Atkinson, New Hampshire, where church bells rang on Sunday mornings, and faith wasn't just a belief, it was a way of life. Her parents, hard-working and devout, had raised her with a clear understanding. Faith wasn't about blind devotion. It was about truth, about conviction, about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. And Karoline had learned that lesson young. In high school, she had watched classmates scoff at religion, treating it as an outdated relic. In college, she had sat in lecture halls where professors dismissed Christianity as a dangerous ideology. She had been called ignorant, brainwashed, and worse. But none of it shook her, because faith wasn't a weakness, it was her strength. By the time she stepped into the political arena, Karoline had built a reputation as someone who wouldn't back down. She had worked in Washington, fought battles in the media, and faced personal attacks from critics who despised everything she stood for. So when Jeremy Kane took aim at her faith, she wasn't rattled. She was ready. Kane had spent years positioning himself as the voice of reason, the fearless truth-seeker who exposed religion as a fraud. His arrogance, his smirks, his relentless mockery, none of it intimidated her, because she understood something he didn't. Faith wasn't about winning arguments. It wasn't about proving skeptics wrong. It was about standing firm in the truth, even when the world laughed in your face. And tonight, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for millions of Americans who had been mocked, dismissed, and told that their beliefs were nothing more than fairy tales. As she waited for the cameras to roll, Karoline took a deep breath. This wasn't just a debate. This was a battle for something far greater, and she wasn't about to lose. Jeremy Kane had built an empire on his ability to tear faith apart. His show, Kane Unchained, was a late-night staple, watched by millions who relished his sharp tongue and merciless wit. He took particular delight in dismantling religious beliefs, reducing centuries of theology to punchlines. To his audience, he was a fearless champion of logic and reason. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was the man behind the persona. Away from the cameras, Kane was restless. He spent his nights pacing in his penthouse apartment, sipping whiskey, staring at the city lights as if they held an answer he couldn't find. He lived for the debate, for the fight, for the thrill of exposing hypocrisy. But why? Why did it matter so much to him? Because once, a long time ago, Jeremy Kane had believed. He had grown up in a small Ohio town where faith was as much a part of life as the changing seasons. His mother read him Bible stories at night. His father led prayers before dinner, and his sister, Rebecca, his best friend, had believed more than any of them. She had been the light in his life, gentle, kind, full of faith. Even when she got sick, leukemia, the word had shattered their world. But Rebecca never lost hope. She prayed, even when the doctors delivered bad news. She believed, even when the treatments failed. Jeremy prayed, too, at first. He begged God for a miracle, for mercy, for anything, but the miracle never came. Rebecca died on a rainy Tuesday morning. Jeremy sat beside her bed, gripping her hand, waiting for the moment she would open her eyes again. She never did. Something inside him broke that day. If God was real, he was cruel. If faith worked, Rebecca would still be alive. And so Jeremy made a choice. If God wouldn't answer him, then he would dedicate his life to proving he never existed in the first place. For years, he had convinced himself that his crusade against faith was about truth, about reason. But deep down, in the places he refused to go, he knew the truth. It wasn't about proving that God wasn't real. It was about punishing him for not saving her. The air in the studio was thick with tension. Jeremy Kane had just delivered one of his signature lines, sharp, dismissive, designed to cut. The audience chuckled, waiting for Karoline to stumble, to falter under the weight of his attack. That's how it always worked. His opponent stammered, got defensive, or crumbled under his relentless logic. But Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression unreadable, her voice calm but deliberate. "You lost someone, didn't you?" The laughter in the audience died instantly. Kane's smirk wavered. His fingers, resting near his glass of water, twitched slightly. For the first time that night, he hesitated. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Karoline's gaze didn't waver. "You prayed for a miracle, and when it didn't come, you decided that God must not exist." The silence in the room was deafening. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, their attention locked on the two figures at the debate table. Kane exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous. This isn't about me. This is about facts, about science, about logic. And the logical conclusion is that faith is a lie people tell themselves to feel better." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "If you really believed that, you wouldn't care so much." Kane's jaw tightened. "I care. Because people like you spread dangerous ideas. Or because it's personal," she countered. "Because once, a long time ago, you did believe, and it broke you." For the first time, Jeremy Kane looked exposed. The cameras caught everything. The flicker of pain that crossed his eyes. The barely perceptible way he swallowed hard. Millions of people were watching this moment unfold. And yet, for just a second, he looked completely alone. Karoline didn't press further. She let the weight of her words settle. "Kane, looked down at the table, then at the audience, as if searching for an escape. There was none. For years, he had controlled every debate, every conversation. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he wasn't the one exposing someone's beliefs. Tonight, the truth had exposed him. The debate had ended, but the conversation was far from over. Within minutes of the broadcast cutting to black, the internet exploded. Clips of Karoline's final words, "You lost someone, didn't you?" were circulating at a dizzying speed. Social media divided into warring factions. Karoline Leavitt destroys Jeremy Kane. Watch an atheist get exposed in real time. Jeremy Kane is human, after all. Kane's fans scrambled to defend him, calling Karoline's words a low blow, a manipulation tactic. But others, people who had followed him for years, were shaken. This wasn't the smug, invincible Kane they were used to. This was a man caught off guard, a man who had momentarily looked vulnerable. And Kane, he disappeared. His show, Kane Unchained, suddenly went on an unscheduled break. His Twitter, usually filled with sharp-witted barbs and dismissive takes on religion, went silent. Journalists speculated, fans debated, critics smelled blood in the water. For the first time in years, Jeremy Kane had nothing to say. Karoline, on the other hand, wasn't celebrating. She had won the debate in the eyes of the public, but she hadn't set out to humiliate him. She had seen something in his expression during those final moments. Something raw, something haunted. This wasn't just a man who didn't believe in God. This was a man who was angry at him, and Karoline knew that kind of anger never came from nowhere. She had been back home for 2 days when she got the message. It wasn't from a network producer, or a political strategist, or even a reporter. It was from an unknown number, a simple text. "We need to talk." No name, no explanation. She stared at the message for a long time. It could be a trick, an ambush. Kane had a history of setting up public figures for takedowns, but something in her gut told her this was different. She took a deep breath and typed out a reply. "Where?" A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. A bar on the west side of the city. No cameras, no audience, just us. Karoline exhaled slowly. Jeremy Kane wasn't done with this conversation, and for the first time, it seemed, he wasn't looking for a debate. He was looking for answers. The bar was quieter than Karoline expected. She had imagined something loud and chaotic, a place where conversations were drowned out by music and clinking glasses. Instead, the dimly lit lounge was subdued, filled with small groups, murmuring over their drinks. It wasn't the kind of place Jeremy Kane's usual crowd would expect to find him, and maybe that was the point. She spotted him immediately, sitting alone at a corner booth. His usual cocky posture was absent. He wasn't smirking, wasn't checking his phone, wasn't scanning the room for attention. He just sat there, a glass of something dark in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. For a brief moment, Karoline hesitated. She had spent years debating men like him, men who sneered at faith, who dismissed people like her as simpletons clinging to fairy tales. She had seen them twist words, set traps, manipulate conversations to humiliate their opponents. What if this was another one of Kane's games? But something inside her, something deeper than logic, deeper than strategy, told her it wasn't. So she walked forward. Kane looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Figured you'd come," he said. Karoline slid into the booth, studying him carefully. "I wasn't sure I would." Kane let out a short, humorless laugh. "Neither was I." A pause stretched between them. Karoline waited, knowing whatever had brought him here wouldn't be easy for him to say. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent years doing what I do because it made sense. Logic, science, reason. It was all clean. No unanswered questions, no mysteries, no disappointments." He picked up his glass but didn't drink from it. "Then you go and say what you said." Karoline folded her hands on the table, because it was true. His eyes flickered with something, resentment maybe, or uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what's true anymore." She didn't push, didn't lecture. Instead, she said, "That's a good place to start." Kane let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I don't even know why I asked you here." But Karoline did, because for the first time in years, Jeremy Kane wasn't looking for an argument. He was looking for something real. Jeremy Kane wasn't used to feeling lost. For years, his entire identity had been built on certainty, on knowing that religion was a lie, that faith was a fantasy, that science and reason held all the answers. He had made a career of tearing belief apart, and he had done it with confidence, with precision. But now he was sitting across from Karoline Leavitt in a dimly lit bar, questioning everything. He took a slow sip of his drink, staring at the table as if it held some kind of hidden truth. "You think you know me," he muttered. "You think I'm just some angry atheist with a chip on his shoulder." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Aren't you?" Kane smirked, but there was no real amusement behind it. "Maybe, but not for the reasons you think." She stayed quiet, letting him speak. He exhaled sharply. "You said something the other night about me losing someone." His fingers tightened around his glass. "You were right." Karoline didn't move, didn't respond. She just listened. Kane let out a hollow chuckle, shaking his head. "I used to believe. When I was a kid, I prayed every night. My sister, Rebecca, she had faith like you, wouldn't believe. Even when she got sick." His voice wavered slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "She prayed every day, even when the doctors said it was hopeless. And I prayed too. I begged God, bargained with him, but he didn't listen." Karoline felt a lump form in her throat. "So you stopped believing." Kane's jaw tightened. "I didn't just stop believing. I made it my mission to tear it all down. If God wouldn't answer, then I'd make sure no one else wasted their time waiting for him." Silence stretched between them. Kane looked up, meeting Karoline's gaze for the first time. "You want to know what scares me?" he said quietly. "The thought that I've spent my whole life fighting something that was real, all along." Karoline's voice was steady when she spoke. "You're not as sure as you thought you were," he scoffed, rubbing a hand over his face. "No, and I hate it." She leaned forward slightly. "Maybe doubt isn't the enemy you think it is." Jeremy Kane had spent years running from faith. Now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to keep running. Jeremy Kane had spent his entire career convincing the world and himself that faith was nothing more than a comforting illusion. But now, sitting across from Karoline Leavitt in a dimly lit bar, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Doubt, not doubt in God's existence. He had buried that a long time ago. No, this was something different. It was doubt in himself, in everything he had built, in the very foundation of his beliefs, and that terrified him. He let out a heavy sigh, tapping his fingers against the table. "You know what the worst part is?" he muttered. "I spent years thinking I was helping people, freeing them from ignorance, making them see the truth." He let out a hollow laugh. "But now, I don't even know what the truth is anymore." Karoline studied him, her expression calm. "Maybe that's because you never really stopped searching for it." Kane scoffed. "If I was searching, I sure as hell wasn't looking in the right places." She leaned forward slightly, then looked somewhere new. His eyes flickered with something, hesitation, frustration, maybe even fear. "You think it's that easy, that I can just undo everything? I built my entire life around the idea that faith is a lie. It's my career, my reputation. If I start questioning that, then what do I have left?" Karoline's voice was gentle but firm. "The truth." Kane ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "And what if I don't like what I find?" She didn't hesitate. "Then at least you'll know you weren't lying to yourself." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so many years fighting against faith, against believers, against the very idea of God. But what if, just what if, he had been fighting the wrong battle all along? He looked at Karoline, searching her face for mockery, for smugness. He found none, just patience, understanding, a willingness to let him wrestle with this on his own terms. For the first time in a long time, Jeremy Kane realized he had a choice to make: keep running from the truth, or finally, for the first time, face it. Months had passed since that night in the bar, since Jeremy Kane had admitted, for the first time, that he wasn't as certain as he had always claimed to be. He had stepped away from his show. At first, his team had chalked it up to exhaustion, a temporary break. But as weeks turned into months, the media frenzy began. Headlines speculated wildly. "Where's Jeremy Kane? Atheist icon disappears after shocking debate loss. Kane's crisis. Is he losing faith? His fans demanded answers. His critics celebrated his silence. But Jeremy Kane wasn't interested in public perception anymore. He was searching for something real. For the first time in years, he read books not to tear them apart, but to understand. He had conversations with people of faith, not to debate them, but to listen. He went to places he had once mocked, churches, prayer groups, even a small-town Bible study, just to observe, to sit in the quiet and feel what he had spent his life rejecting. And slowly, something began to change. It wasn't an instant revelation, no blinding light or divine voice, just a slow unraveling of the walls he had built around himself. The more he searched, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, faith wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about trusting even when you didn't. One day, Karoline received an email. "I don't know what I believe yet, but I want to know. Thank you for making me ask the question." She smiled, reading the words carefully, knowing what they meant. Jeremy Kane had spent years defining himself by what he didn't believe. Now, for the first time, he was asking what he did. She didn't need to respond. The battle for Jeremy Kane's soul wasn't over, but it was no longer a battle against God. It was a journey toward him, and for a man who had spent a lifetime running from faith, that was a miracle in itself.